Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com.
On Raglan Road of an autumn day, I saw her first and anew.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Elixir Poetry Podcast. Today we're talking to Ann Moroney, who is from Ireland. Hello, Ann.
Hello, Helen.
It's really lovely to have you here today. Do you have a poem that you would like to share with us?
I do. I'm going to talk about Patrick Kavanagh's On Raglan Road.
Wonderful. And would you like to start by reading it to us?
Of course, I'll do so now. On Raglan Road, on an autumn day, I met her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I might one day rue. I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day. On Grafton Street in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge of the deep ravine where can be seen the worth of passion's pledge. The Queen of Hearts still making tarts, and I am making hay. I loved too much, and by such and such is happiness worn away. I gave her gifts of the mind, I gave her the secret sign that's known to the artists who've known the true gods of sound and stone. And word and tint I did not stint, for I gave her poems to say, with her own name there and her own dark hair, like clouds over fields of May. On a quiet street where old ghosts meet, I see her walking now, away from me so hurriedly my reason must allow, that I had wooed not as I should a creature made of clay. When the angel woos the clay, he'd lose his wings at the dawn of day.
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. I can really see why this is such a well-loved poem. Tell me, why do you like it so much?
Oh, there's so many reasons why I like this poem. It's beloved in Ireland, first of all, and around the world, but probably the main reason, and for a lot of people, was, if you can see by the way I read it, I don't read it how poetry should be read. I read it how it's sung, which is how most people are exposed to this poem by Patrick Kavanagh, because it was immortalised by Luke Kelly of the Dubliners, and made into a very famous song, a folk song, a ballad. So it's very automatic to read it the way Luke Kelly sang it. But I grew up most school children in Ireland grow up learning the 10th whistle to play on St. Patrick's Day in a parade. And one of the main tunes you play is The Dawning of the Day, which is a really simple tune, but it's what this poem was set to. So Kavanagh wrote it with a tune in mind, not necessarily that tune, but eventually it was set to that tune and was given to Luke Kelly. So it wasn't written as a song, but Kavanagh wrote it with music in mind. So I guess from like childhood, I would have first of all played Dawning of the Day and then heard it sung. And then I went to university in Dublin and I studied English literature, and I had the privilege of studying Kavanagh. I'd come across it as a poem before that, but I properly was able to study Kavanagh and that poem in university. So yeah, there's just something so beautiful about how he writes.
It's really beautiful, and so many people have sung it. If you look on YouTube, there are so many people who've sung it. There's the version that you're talking about, which is super famous, but also Sinead O'Connor sang it, and there's a video on YouTube of her singing it as well, which is really amazing. The other thing that I was really struck by is that this is a real love story, and it's a true love story of someone that he fell in love with. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so it's again one of the reasons why I really enjoy it, because it's a ballad of unrequited, the ultimate unrequited love. And what's really interesting is, and a lot of people know this about the background, but some people don't, is that it's, a lot of the time unrequited love comes from love and then rejection. But Kavanagh knew that this sort of love affair wasn't even an affair. It was a sort of far off fancy was doomed from the beginning. And so he writes it about, falling in love, knowing that there's no hope, or knowing that there's nothing's going to come from it. So Kavanagh was a sort of down at heel poet in Dublin, famously, and he went through various bouts of poverty and didn't have much success a lot of the time with his writing. He was very much outside of the higher literary canon.
It wasn't until he was much older that he suddenly got taken on and accepted and praised. I feel he had to wait a very, very long time to be accepted.
Absolutely, and he was from such a rural, poor background. He left school at 13. He was very sort of abrasive as well, and he fell out with lots of colleagues, and he was an alcoholic, and he criticised lots of people. He was a bit of a villain and a maverick in his life, and then he got, again, immortalised after his death. But he wrote, and this wasn't an immediate hit at all. It was only when it featured in his collection of poetry that people took it on, then when Luke Kelly sung it, and now it's his most famous poem. But he lived at the time on Raglan Road in Dublin, which is in a really lovely and very upper class part of Dublin, and still is and was at the time. He lived in a boarding house, and he would sort of frequent the various pubs around. And there was a medical student called Hilda Moriarty who also lived on that road. And her father was a doctor, and they had lots of money, and she was very beautiful, and she had long dark hair, and Kavanagh fell in love with her. They had a bit of a friendship. I mean, there's various accounts, but they had she sort of entertained him. She liked literature, and she liked being the object of this poet's eye, but they were never properly together. Kavanagh just sort of followed her around Dublin. And she once famously said to him that he writes too much about soil and the countryside, and why doesn't he write about love? So he wrote about his love for her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's very, it's sad, but it's just the way the sort of the doom that that he knows it's not a possibility. And that's how happiness is worn away, as he says, that he is loved not as he should.
But he seemed to have honoured that love. From what I can gather, he only got married just before he died. And it's almost like he was honouring that lost love all of his life. I don't know whether he saw it like that. The most meaningful relationship with him was an imaginary one, or one that hadn't happened.
Yeah, completely. And people of various critics over the years have sort of either played down or played up this relationship. But from what I've read, after he died, she sent flowers in the shape of a H for her name to his house. So I think she had a certain fondness for him. But he was quite a tragic character.
Yeah.
Which makes this poem all the more tragic, because it was really from the heart. He really did. It was this classic class divide, and he was he was never going to be accepted by her family.
This sounded a bit like we had a podcast just recently with Richard talking about John Clare, and there was also a story of John Clare falling in love with someone and not being of the right class, because he also was someone who lived in a rural area, who was brought up very poor, a true peasant, and he fell in love with someone who was of a higher class, wasn't allowed to marry her. But he went on and married someone else, and apparently carried on writing poems about this girl that he was really in love with, which caused quite a lot of tension, as you can imagine, in the marital household. But this is often the way. And like Kavanagh, had lots of arguments with the established poetry community, and a lot of those things can be put down to the urban-rural divide and to class, I think. Both poets, I think, were making really, really important statements through their work about the direct receipt of reality, if you like, being, clearing away the dross and being really straightforward and focused on what they're really seeing and what they're really experiencing. And they both had that in common. And in fact, I've just been talking to someone who was talking about a Chinese poet, Han Dong, who's going to feature in a few weeks' time in our podcast. And yet again, this is someone who, eschewed not certainly the traditions of verse, but eschewed the pretensions, if you like, of the literati. It's a very similar cast of mind, And I mean, that poet claims that his poem is written for nobody. He's not addressing any particular group of people, and that therefore he has to depersonalize it and make it incredibly direct. Yeah, it's really amazing. Do you write poetry as well, Anne?
I don't write poetry. I harbour desires to write poetry. I think I'm in my stage of just consuming as much as I can, and I'm always so interested in the personal side of it. Sort of the opposite of taking the artist away from the art. I always find I think I connect deeper when I know more about the background of certain
the person behind. Yeah.
Which is probably why I really like this. And Kavanagh is such a, as you're saying about John Clare, he's in such a fascinating tradition of going against the grain of this sort of literary Irish revival at the time, because a lot of high society and the most famous poets, such as Yeats, were wealthy and Anglo-Irish and existed in a tradition that was completely outside of what Kavanagh knew. He was from rural County Monaghan, and he was the son of a farmer and a shoe cobbler. And he didn't finish his education, but had this immense talent and immense drive and desire to write about what he saw and what was the sort of real authentic rural Irish experience. And he was the first person of the time that was doing that. And I think he sort of tried to tear down this vision of the Free State, because it was such a new state at the time, of being this sort of land of plenty and saints and scholars. And he was like, I've grown up in such poverty. And he died in poverty as well. The rural Ireland has always been fetishized and romanticized, and Yeats and Synge did that for years. But Kavanagh was a true product of the poverty in rural Ireland and wrote so authentically, which then paved the way for other famous poets such as Seamus Heaney, who also... Yeah.
Seamus Heaney was really wants to honour Kavanagh's legacy. There's been a recent project, actually. I was just reading something about it. We're talking about the difference between, if you like, scholars who investigate, rural traditions and myths and so on, and the difference between that and someone who is speaking from within that tradition. And there's been a project to send school children out back to their grandparents' home areas to interview all of the elders. It's actually a project based on an idea of rewilding, but they are charged with going to talk to their grandparents and very elderly people about plants and animals from their childhood, and what would be grown when they were children and what was still there and what's disappeared and so on. But also they've asked them for any stories and tales or songs or poems that they remember from those times that witness the existence of nature in their particular place in Ireland. I thought it was a really beautiful project, and also it cuts through this idea of, if you like, a scientist looking in from the outside, because those people will be giving their own versions of things that they've lived, and it will be interesting to see how different that is. This idea of reception is very much affected by who is the speaker, if you like. So it's quite a fascinating idea. And I think, and I think someone like Kavanagh was doing all of this instinctually. It was just his natural space, right, to speak in the way that he spoke, So it's amazing.
It's amazing how it was, almost it wasn't, but the sort of similar to divine inspiration. Like he wasn't brought up in an environment that nurtured education, or learning. He was just he was raised in an environment that he just had to live for survival, which was what the experience in rural Ireland was at the time for a lot of people. So it's fascinating that study's happening. And I think it's so important because, again, in a lot of countries, it was an oral tradition of art that was passed down. A lot of the songs and poetry wasn't written down. I mean, a lot of it was, but there's communities and, cultures that are, as Ireland, still enters modernity, whatever that means. There's a dying tradition there. And I'm from rural Ireland. I'm not from a farming background, but my mum is, and she grew up in a tiny farm in rural County Mayo, where both her parents, it was an arranged marriage made out of necessity between two neighbours. And like, my mum was one of 6 children. They all went to school, and through the Free Education Act were able to go on to university. But the difference in my grandmother's life and my life, and even my mother's life, is stark. And how just the poverty and how people survived, but also found music and poetry and stories within such, I guess, minimal and very stark times. And the tradition of telling stories is really Irish. It's very, very, the Shanachia, what's it called? Is what it's called. Or the Shanachie, which is the storyteller. Yeah, it's a very rich tradition.
I think this is it really was really critical probably for Kavanagh. He talked about his fear of, or his sort of, if you like, his analysis of extreme poverty not being just about physical need, but about sort of spiritual poverty. And yet, of course, along with that, he will have been surrounded by this intangible heritage, if you like, these stories, these songs, the storytelling, the traditions of Ireland and its music. Now, do you say you studied English literature and Irish literature, presumably?
Yes, so a mixture of I studied English literature and history, and Irish literature as well within my course. So I did, a lot of the poets. I'd studied at Trinity College Dublin, which is a great Irish studies department.
And do you speak Irish?
Yes, I do. I like to say I'm fluent. I definitely was more fluent, if that's a thing, a few years ago. I'm a little rusty now, but I do speak Irish. I wasn't raised speaking it, but I learned it through living in the Gaeltacht in the summers. The Gaeltacht is the Irish-speaking area in Ireland.
Oh wow, this is really, really interesting. And so, have you read any really fascinating Irish-speaking poets?
So, in school, we would have all learnt some various variations of Irish language poetry. The most famous being Antoine Raftera, who wrote, the poet's called Antoine Raftera.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote, his most famous poem is On Tara Keir, which means the coming of the spring. And he's one of the most famous Irish language poets. Mm-hmm. He wrote very beautifully. And there was this tradition before Kavanagh's time, throughout the 1800s and the early 20th century, of this figure in Irish culture, rural Irish culture, called An Sapien Fánach, which is essentially a sort of travelling labourer and poet. And there was often no fixed work for these people because the work was very scarce. It was obviously during famine times, and they would travel around Ireland and work and write poetry. And
presumably read and speak poetry in the pubs at night.
Yeah. So sort of like a bard, I guess, but much less romantic and much more, they couldn't find fixed employment. Mm-hmm. So it was a sort of way of travelling around. It's always been a big part of Irish culture, going from place to place and spreading art and tradition. But often it's very linked with need. Yeah. Not out of willingness. It was need to survive.
And today, Ireland seems to have this wonderful appreciation of the need for art and poetry and so on. I mean, even the Irish tax system recognises artists and writers to the extent where they don't have to pay tax in the way that people doing other types of jobs do, which I always think is absolutely marvellous. And I think it brings lots of people to go and live in Ireland that wouldn't have done so, because of that. The only other country that I know of that does a similar thing is Canada. And therefore, Canada has this wealth of creatives, especially film people who are feeding into the arts. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is that, I know this sounds like a stereotype, but whenever I've been in Ireland, I've always been really struck by the sort of grand sufficiency of the average Irish person's lexicon. And it might be because it's slightly different. slightly different place, and so people are using slightly different words sometimes to the ones that we'd use in say England. But I've always felt that a country that is voluble and talks a lot, and spends a lot of time in the pub actually, that has this incredible wealth of vocabulary that, in our weird way of thinking about class systems, we tend to think of that as something that is afforded to the educated classes, But actually, my experience is that the more oral a culture is, the more vivid and alive the range of vocabulary is that people are using on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if this is just a completely ridiculous idea or whether it is something that resonates with other people. So I was just wondering whether for someone like Kavanagh, he's got an incredible wealth of language, and whether actually he wasn't necessarily looking in books to find new words, but that actually that was the common parlance, if you like. Would you agree with that?
What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, completely. And I mean, Irish people are famed for talking so much. There are quiet, obviously every society is quiet people, but on average, they love to talk and sort of spin a yarn almost, and sort of just...
It just always seemed so creative. I might be romanticising or doing whatever the Irish equivalent of orientalising is, but that has been my experience there, Yes, I don't know.
I mean, I'm as guilty of romanticising Ireland as anyone, mainly just because I don't live there anymore, which is a very typical experience of anyone who emigrates. You sort of romanticise your home and culture. But yeah, in terms of description, in making something funny, in making something emotional, in making something sad, and Irish people are incredibly sentimental and incredibly nostalgic, and will talk about the same event or the same story for years and years and years, which... And, as time goes on, threads are added. And there's a very good phrase, which I'm sure, I don't know if it's typical to Ireland at all, but never letting the truth getting in the way of a good story. And how it's not pragmatic. It's not about what happened. It's about how you tell it and how people enjoy it.
Mm.
And I do, in terms of Kavanagh, I do think, even despite, not necessarily having formal education, back then the reality was families were very big. Catholic rural Ireland, families were huge. People, my grandmother was one of 13, for example, which was a huge problem because everyone was so poor and there wasn't enough food in general. But it meant that you were constantly surrounded by not just your family, but your wide extended family, because people didn't move away unless, say, the father of the house went to England to work. So you essentially grew up in a community of relatives, friends, neighbours, older brothers and sisters, everything. So, and because, these were small farming communities, I'm sure Kavanagh probably never had, besides walking through the countryside, much time alone. There were small houses. You were surrounded by talk and stories. So, this idea of an isolated nuclear family didn't exist back then. It couldn't.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, and absolutely true. And it makes everything so vibrant, I think, for him in terms of the way he approaches language. So you now live in London. Did you find that there was a big cultural shock when you arrived in this alien world that is Britain?
Definitely, yes. Now, I lived in Edinburgh before I moved to London. So when I left Ireland, I went to college in Dublin, as I said, and then I immediately left after my final year and I went to do my master's in Edinburgh. So I guess sort of Scotland eased me into England, I always say, eased me into the UK, and then I moved to London. Yes, there's definitely cultures so different here. London's its own beast in many ways. But I mean, as is quite typical, Irish people stick together. So I have a lot of my Irish friends are here. There's a huge Irish community.
Yeah,
but I do think
you're a musician as well, right?
Yes, I play Irish music.
So is that how you kept your community going, by playing Irish music?
Well, yeah, in many ways, yes. And that's really widened it, which has been great. A lot of my friends from university are here anyway already. So I had a great established group. And I took up playing. I used to play lots in school and university. I sort of let it go a bit when I moved to Edinburgh. And it's just a great way to be back within a very vibrant and very big culture within London. Irish have been in London for however long, but it's just a wonderful way to feel connected to home. And Irish people love feeling connected to home. It's a big part of our identity, more so than when we live there, which is typical for everybody.
That's
yeah,
really
like
lovely.
I mean, it is. It's wonderful. It's so nice. I guess in terms of cultural differences, the main one that I've noticed in terms of work settings or in other places is Irish people are not that formal. I mean, from my experience anyway, we're quite informal and quite chatty and very, like things to be quite humorous and quite open.
So I have one final question about this poem to ask you. Have you got someone that you fell in love with that you know is completely out of your reach, that you would never have, and that's one of the reasons why you love this poem? I mean, it speaks to everyone who suffers from unrequited love, right?
I'm sure now in my past there's been many there has definitely been many. No, not at all. My lovely boyfriend, who hopefully still is not walking away from me on a quiet Grafton Street so hurriedly. But no, I'm a bit of a hopeless romantic. I always have been. I've always loved books about unrequited love as in my youth, which I hopefully am still slightly in. I definitely experienced that. And it's sort of a universe. I mean, everyone's experienced, the sort of dreams and hopes of it all. But there's something so poignant about it. Any time I read literature that it features in, it just sort of, it really tugs at my heartstrings. And there's just ways that people write about it so beautifully. But I think one of my favorite lines in it, because you can sort of see Kavanagh's bitterness slightly, bitter's maybe too harsh a word, at the end, where he says that I had wooed, not as I should, a creature made of clay, and how she's made of clay. She's fickle. There's no substance. She doesn't have the depth to love him back, and that's what he's telling himself. And there's just something so, I mean, beautifully written, but also quite poignant about it.
Yeah. Oh, it's really lovely to hear you talk about this poet and to talk about Ireland, and it's been lovely to talk to you, Anne. And I wonder whether for our readers you could read the poem one more time so that they can now listen to it in the context that you've given it.
Of course. On Raglan Road, on an autumn day, I met her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I might one day rue. I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day. On Grafton Street in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge of the deep ravine where can be seen the worth of passion's pledge. The Queen of Hearts still making tarts, and I am making hay. I loved too much, and by such and such is happiness worn away. I gave her gifts of the mind. I gave her the secret sign that's known to the artists who have known the true gods of sound and stone. And word and tint I did not stint, for I gave her poems to say, with her own name there and her own dark hair, like clouds over fields of May. On a quiet street where old ghosts meet, I see her walking now, away from me so hurriedly my reason must allow, that I had wooed not as I should a creature made of clay. When the angel woos the clay, he'd lose his wings at the dawn of day.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. And you also get the feeling that he's bartered his poetic soul to that love as well, that somehow he feels that has distorted or changed the way that he writes or can write, Amazing. Anne, thank you so much for giving us a taste of Irish poetry. It's been lovely to listen to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.
Made of clay, when the angel woos, the clay he'd lose his wings at the dawn.